Here briefly, we've said quite a lot and see what questions you may have, and then we'll keep going. Okay. Okay, sure. So someone's asking for a little bit of clarity with the pre and post ganglionic. And I've kind of cleared my drawing, but there's another drawing coming up that I'll talk about. So here, we can see that a little bit better here. So we've got these two neurons in series as a part of the autonomic nervous system. It's always two neurons. And again, I'm going to be pointing out differences to the somatic nervous system because it's really important for you to be thinking about ways that the autonomic nervous system structurally and functionally differ from the somatic nervous system that we'll talk about next. So in the somatic nervous system, there's always one neuron. In the autonomic nervous system, there's always two neurons in series. So we've got the preganglionic neuron, the postganglionic neuron. Now, the length of these neurons differ in the sympathetic system when compared to the parasympathetic system. And if we jump back to this slide, actually, we can kind of appreciate that difference here. So these are the preganglionic, oops. So here are our, can you guys see this? My cursor is not showing up. Okay, here are our preganglionic neurons. They arise from T1 to L2 of the spinal cord, and you can see how this branch is really short before it synapses at the ganglia. And so this is the sympathetic chain that I was referring to. So the fibers here synapse at the sympathetic chain, so a very short preganglionic neuron, and then the longer neuron, the second neuron, goes all the way out to the effector glands that are being targeted. Whereas in the parasympathetic system, the fibers arise from brainstem and spinal cord. They travel all the way out near the organ that they're innervating, and the ganglia is closer to that organ than to the area that the fibers arise from. So we have a longer preganglionic neuron and a much shorter postganglionic neuron, okay? Now, things are going to get slightly more complicated here because in the sympathetic system, we have two other options, two other routes of communication for these fibers. But the main route of communication is from the segments T1 to L2, synapsing out onto the autonomic ganglia, which is collectively forming the sympathetic chain. And then from these autonomic ganglia, they synapse out to their effector organ, okay? So that's the main route of communication. We'll talk about some exceptions coming up in a bit. Okay, so I'm getting another question here. Does the ganglia just refer to a synapse in the autonomic nervous system, or is there a functional difference from other synapses? So that's a great question. So it's just referring to a synapse that's not in the central nervous system. And it's autonomic, specifically when you look at the autonomic nervous system, but we do have other types of ganglia. But anytime there's a collection of soma or cell body that's not in brain or spinal cord, we call that a ganglia. In the autonomic nervous system, it's specifically known as a autonomic ganglia, and there's really no functional difference between this synapse and any other type of synapse. It's just the location of the soma and cell bodies are not where they normally are, which is in the brain and spinal cord, central nervous system. Okay. Okay, so some excellent questions coming up here. All right, so just kind of continue on here. We talked about our two different neurons. We've got the preganglionic, postganglionic, and then we talk about this autonomic ganglia, which is the communication between those neurons. And again, because it's not in the central nervous system, we're calling it a ganglia. There are also intrinsic neurons that we're not going to talk about too much that also help to bridge the communication between some of these pre and post ganglia, these pre and post ganglionic neurons. Okay, I'm having all types of technical difficulties today. Please bear with me. Let's see. Okay, here we go. All right, and then just to give some details here as it pertains to the examples of effector organs, these are all the organs that we're looking at in the center of that schematic diagram. So again, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, all types of glands, and we'll talk about some exceptions to these. And then adipose tissue as well. Adipose really only in the sympathetic nervous system. And again, we'll kind of clarify these examples as we go on here, but these are the target organs or effector organs that the autonomic nervous system governs or controls. And then here's just another view of that, that anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. We've got the fibers arising from different areas of the central nervous system, be it brain, spinal cord, brain stem, wherever the fibers are coming from, depending on what branch we're looking at specifically. Then that neuron synapses out onto an autonomic ganglia, and then onto the effector organs in question. So now let's kind of look a little bit closer here at each of these divisions separately and talk about how the anatomy differs slightly between the two. So again, we've got fibers arising from the lateral horn in terms of the cross section of the spinal cord, sometimes from the intermediate lateral cell column, which is kind of right next to the lateral horn. But for the most part, for our purposes, the lateral horn is where these fibers arise from, okay? And so the general anatomy is that we've got a shorter preganglionic neuron in the sympathetic system, a long postganglionic neuron going from the ganglia all the way out to the effector organs that they're targeting. And then the ganglia we talked about as being collectively referred to as the sympathetic chain. All right. And this is an actual physical anatomical structure that you can look into the body. If you kind of remove the visceral organs and the peritoneum, it's right next to the spinal cord, and it looks just like what it sounds like. It's like a bunch of pearls on a string, or chain type configuration that's associated with either side of the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the sympathetic chain there. And so that's the main route of communication for the sympathetic nervous system. T1 to L2, so again, remember that the fibers come from those specific spinal segments out to sympathetic chain and then to the effector organs. Now, there are two alternate routes of communication, or two exceptions to that general anatomy. The first one is that we can also have preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system synapse onto collateral ganglia. Collateral ganglia, sometimes referred to as prevertebral ganglia. These are ganglia that are not a part of the sympathetic chain. They're usually associated with abdominal organs or pelvic organs like the bladder or the kidneys. And so they don't have synapses on the sympathetic chain. These ganglia are associated elsewhere. And let's just jump back to this slide where we can appreciate some of those collateral ganglia. All right. So the main route of communication being synapsing onto the ganglia, which are part of the sympathetic chain. And then one of the alternate routes was synapsing onto a ganglia that's not a part of the sympathetic chain. We call this a collateral ganglia. And these fibers usually go to some of the abdominal and pelvic organs, rectum, kidney, bladder, intestines, etc. Okay, bladder. And then the third route of communication here is synapsing onto the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal glands, so just to give some anatomy here, are paired organs. They sit atop the kidneys. They've got two distinct layers. They've got a cortex, which is an outer, lighter staining, paler appearing region of the adrenal. And we can appreciate that difference here. So here's an image of the adrenal gland. And then it's got a darker, kind of deeper staining medulla, which is more of the internal region of the adrenal gland, right? And so preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic system can also synapse onto the adrenal medulla cells. The cells that are located in the adrenal medulla are called chromaffin cells. And these cells behave just like postganglionic neurons, right? In fact, there's research done and scientists have actually taken chromaffin cells and put them in an appropriate medium, and they actually begin to grow axons, right? They behave so much like neurons and ganglionic cells in that they are just a cell form of a neuron, if that makes sense, okay? So these are modified sympathetic postganglionic cells, really acting like postganglionic neurons, and they're found in the adrenal medulla. They're called clomiphene cells. And so this is the third route of communication for a preganglionic neuron to synapse. So let's kind of go over that here. They can synapse onto the sympathetic chain. They can synapse onto a ganglia that's not in the sympathetic chain, a collateral ganglia. And then they can synapse onto an adrenal medulla clomiphene cell, which is pretty much acting like a postganglionic neuron, okay? Now, when a preganglionic neuron synapses onto a clomiphene cell, there's a release of what we call catecholamines, which are really hormones that are released into the blood. There's mostly epinephrine, some norepinephrine, and an even smaller amount of dopamine that's released into the blood. And so we can think of these as really being neurotransmitters, just the way a postganglionic neuron would release neurotransmitter. But because these are cells, and because it's actually being released into the blood, these are considered hormones when they are actually circulated in the blood, and a neurotransmitter if it's circulated at a synapse, okay? So really important connection to make, that the chromaffin cells act just like postganglionic neurons. They release their secretions just the way a postganglionic neuron would release its neurotransmitter. But because these neurotransmitters are entering the blood, we refer to them as hormones here, or catecholamines, and these are usually epinephrine, and to some degree norepinephrine and dopamine.